Welcome, everyone. I am Jay Wallace. I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy at UC Berkeley and a scholar and teacher in the broad area of moral philosophy. And I'm delighted to have been invited to moderate this session for the Cal Alumni Association on Ethics and Identity. And we've got a great group of panelists assembled today. And I think we should start off with some introductions. Let's begin with Shanti.
Hi, I'm Shanti Bright Bryan. I graduated from Berkeley in the 90s. I'm happy to be here. I am a member of the Muskogee Creek Tribe, and I am the founding president of the Native and Indigenous Alumni Association. I'm also an attorney, and I'm a teacher of fairness, building community trust and equity through my organization, File Break Justice, mostly with criminal justice professionals, but with other civic leaders also.
Shanti, do you have a acknowledgement that you'd like to read out as well?
Thank you for the opportunity. We'd like to recognize that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of Lichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. We have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. As members of the Berkeley community, it's vitally important that we not only recognize the history of the land on which we stand, but also we recognize the Muwekma Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities today.
Chuck, you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. And it's a really pleasure to be part of this panel. In fact, this is actually part 3 of the series of dialogues that we've actually started since Juneteenth or June 19. And in fact, the first one we actually had it, between NWA, Black Lives Matter Cleveland, as well as representatives from other Black communities. And then really the second one, where we actually just about, in fact, a week ago, we have like 3 prominent Black women leaders, actually in the dialogues with the Asian community. And this one, it's really exciting because not only the 2 communities, we have all the other communities are part of this conversation. Myself, I am, Chuck Ng, the president of the Berkeley Chinese Alumni International Association. For us, we actually have been around for more than 10 years. It really is the global Chinese and Chinese American community because there has been a lot of not only domestic Chinese Americans who are studying at Berkeley, but there's been a lot of about as much as almost like 10% as the overseas Chinese community, which are really from China, from Southeast Asia, from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, and many other places. So we see that all of us, we don't just, we're not restricted by geographic regions, meaning that people who come to Berkeley and study here, they could be anywhere in the world in terms of working. So we want to support these folks, and increasingly really sort of the Asia Pacific region. So we'll really do a lot of the collaborations on the business front, mentorship front, as well as actually host the largest international conference on innovation and entrepreneurship. So thank you for the opportunity. Excited to be here today.
My name's Raymond Banks. I'm a philosophy major. I graduated in 2008. I was born in West Philadelphia. I'm a justice in packet or formerly incarcerated Navy veteran. I piloted the first cross-enrollment program with dedicated academic support for veterans and justice-involved community college students in 2015. It was designed to demystify Cal by experiencing Cal. I now do so for Berkeley Underground Scholars in Cal's philosophy department. I've also served on the Oakland branch of the NAACP. I chaired the Veterans Committee. and I co-founded Cal Armed Forces Alumni. And the mission of Cal Armed Forces Alumni is to ensure that current and future alums reflect the diversity of the military. In other words, Cal Armed Forces Alumni will make certain that all future and current Cal vets, regardless of era, branch of service, have access to resources to help them gain admission to Cal, achieve academic success while enrolled, and to develop personally and professionally. To do so, we will assist veterans, women, first generation, disabled, socioeconomically disadvantaged, LGBTQ, student parents, formerly incarcerated, communities of color, and widows and widowers of veterans. Thank you. Thank you, Chuck.
My name is Lupe Gallegos Diaz. I go by she, her, and ella, and I am very glad and honored to be here with all of you. Thank you for the invitation to share words with all of you this morning. I graduated from UC Berkeley in 1986 with a master's in social work and a certificate of philosophy and ethnic studies in 1995. I come from a long line of working class immigrants and also a strong matriarchal family from Mexico City and Guanajuato, Mexico. I was actually born and raised in Redwood City here in the Bay Area and grew up in a very entrepreneurial family that had lots of great spirit on not only working hard, but giving back to the community. I currently work here at UC Berkeley as the Director of Chicanx Latinx Student Development Office. And I'm also a lecturer in the Department of Ethnic Studies and Chicano Studies program. And now I've been on campus now for 30 years. My job is to work specifically with undergrads and grads on retention to have them not only get here to Berkeley, but actually complete their studies. And so part of my work is creating community among students, staff, also faculty and alumni. So, and I'm also the co-founder recently of the UC 10 Campus UC Chicano Latino Alumni Association. And again, I'm very glad to be with all of you today.
Thanks to everyone for those interesting introductions. Just to get going, you know, we've got a variety of different kind of communities represented on this panel, and I think it would be great to start off our substantive discussion by just inviting each of you to say a little bit about your own sense of your community. If you could just say one thing about what you think is distinctive or about the culture or history of your community, I think that would be helpful for us all just to get a sense of where everyone's coming from. Shanti, why don't we start with you?
It's hard to limit it to one thing, but I'll try to be brief. I think actually not unique to the Native, this label of Native is that there's so many groups within that label. So there's 573 federally recognized tribes in the US, and many, many more that are not recognized by the federal government, including the Ohlone people, which I referenced earlier. So we're a very diverse group, and so it's hard to make generalizations. I'd say, though, that one is this experience and trauma of genocide. So in pre-colonial times, there were between 10 and 20 million natives living on this land. And by the 1890s, that had been decimated to about 250,000 people. So we shared an experience and the legacy of genocide, the forced takings of our land. We share the experience of being part of sovereign nations. I'm a citizen of the Muskogee Nation. And that presents sort of this dualistic experience of being part of two cultures and actually citizens of two nations. And finally, I guess, and most importantly, I'd say we share the value of persistence and endurance and sort of this communal-based worldview.
Great.
Thank you, Shanti. Actually, I also want to kind of contextualize also for, again, the whole community, Chicanx, Latinx community. We are very, very diverse in very various different ways. in both our language, our music, but I think, again, grounding it within our historical context is all the way, Mesoamerica, all the way from our Mayan, Olmeca, and Aztec roots, all of, again, both indigenous and also communities of particular cultural references for each of our communities, all the way from Mexico, all the way down south to the Caribbean. I would say also we're very diverse in different ways. I think the whole historical context of colonization and genocide also are very prevalent in how we've actually had to pull together. And I would also say it's been a history of survival and resistance, and particular around systems of capitalism and, of course, other what I would call educational systems and capitalism, particularly in general. But if I had to maybe try to bring some together, also particular values, three actually really resonate with me while I was thinking about these questions. One is intergenerational wisdom and how we teach and learn with each other. And so I really think within our particular community is how do we do that with our children, with our elders, and everybody in between, that there is this pulling together of both family and community around intergenerational wisdom. The other one is the concept of familismo, which is really the concept of the focus on the family and how do we come together to not only survive, but thrive and help each other. And I think the last one I was going to say is creando comunidad, which is creating community. And I really like the concept of transcommunality that John Child speaks about, on how we can still be individual, but yet be collective at the same time in how we work within community. So.
Great.
I want to share with everyone a speech delivered by Willie Lynch on the bank of the James River. In the colony of Virginia in 1712, Lynch was a British slave owner in the West Indies, and he was invited to the colony of Virginia in 1712 to teach his methods to slave owners there. The term lynching is derived from his name. The term hanging or hanging black people is derived from Lynch's name. And so he says, I have a foolproof method for controlling your black slaves. I guarantee every one of you that if installed correctly, it will control the slaves for at least 300 years. My method is simple. Any member of your family or your overseer can use it. I've outlined a number of differences amongst the slaves, and I take these differences and make them bigger. I use fear, distrust, and envy for control purposes. I shall assure you that distrust is stronger than trust, and envy stronger than adulation, respect, or admiration. The black slaves after receiving this indoctrination shall carry on and will be self-refueling and self-generating for hundreds of years, maybe thousands. Do not forget, you must pitch the old black male versus the young black male, and the young black male against the old black male. You must use the dark-skinned slaves versus the light-skinned slaves, and the light-skinned slaves versus the dark-skinned slaves. You must use the female versus the male, and the male versus the female. You must also have white servants and overseers who distrust all blacks. But it is necessary that your slaves trust and depend on us. They must love and respect and trust only us. Gentlemen, these kits are the keys to control. Use them. Have your wives and children use them. Never miss an opportunity. If used intensively for 1 year, the slaves themselves will remain perpetually distrustful. Thank you, gentlemen. I share that because a lot of these practices are still in place. And I think it's really decimated the black community. And I think this is one of the most important points in American history. I think it's even more important than the civil rights movement, because it allows us to actually see that there was a intentional undermining of black people for, as he says, 300 to 1,000 years. Thank you.
Actually, very similar to what Shanti as well as Lupe is that actually the Asian American community is extremely diverse. We're about, closing into about 7% of the US population. But in fact, we have many, many ethnic groups within the Asian American community. But I think also the values that we share are sort of the family, as well as education. I think there's been a lot of emphasis of that. But we've also shared a lot of the struggles. There's something called the model minority myth, which, I think, unfortunately, a lot of the projections out there is not correct. Of course, there are certainly a lot of very successful Asian Americans, but there's also been incredibly harsh under this current time. And especially you guys all know about the Asian hate, right? So really sort of the situations is all these strugglings. And we've actually been, as Asian Americans, have been discriminated historically as well. So I think that we share that struggle, if you will, along with all my other colleagues here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Chuck. I'm really struck that each of the communities that you come from are communities that are bound together in part by shared histories of injustice or oppression, genocide, exclusion, prejudice, and so on. These are persistent failures persisting into the present day to kind of live up to our, our founding ideals as a country of acknowledging that each person matters equally in some ways. And before we get to remedies, I think it might be useful for us to pause and just reflect a little bit together about where the persistent tendencies to prejudice and exclusion and oppression might come from, so psychologically or systematically. For our next question, I think I'd like to invite each of you to just reflect a little bit about what some of the forces might be that persist into this day, and that lead us to fail to acknowledge, the full equal standing of members of the communities that you belong to. I'll just add that some of the antagonism toward members of other groups also percolates down into the relations between the different communities, members of the different communities that you belong to. So what are some of the things that might lead people to react to this way, to difference, and to explain our persistent failure to kind of live up to our founding ideals of equality?
I guess I would have to say denial. Is, I would say, the main cause of this, just collective denial that our country was founded on slavery and the genocide and forced taking of native land. So I think when we don't recognize that as true, we don't recognize that history of our country, there's no acknowledgement that that has created these inequities, these gross inequities and gross injustices that we see today. So, without that acknowledgement of the past, the acknowledgement that all of this that we have now is based on all of that violence, I just don't think there can be healing. I don't think there can be change. I don't think there can be really moving forward. There can't be amends. That's my view. If we don't recognize our shared experience of that, then there's no moving forward to this ideal.
I completely agree. I think for me, the next step, aside from acknowledging and denial and trying to face that, I think the other step that I would take is actually looking at our institutions that we have in this country and really looking at the policies and practices that have created the inequities and in this particular country that has also, of course, I can say as part of the imperialism everywhere, but particularly in this country. And some of those examples that come to mind are, for example, the propositions in California. I'm thinking of various ones, particularly around 187, 209, 227, all of them based on a very one narrative, monolithic narrative that we're trying to create, particularly around like the English only and the Proposition 227, but just the particular policies and practices that we've had historically in this country against both immigrants and other communities of color. I think it's important also to acknowledge that we still have those systems into place, whether it's our economic system of capitalism and or our educational system that still have embedded particularly racism, sexism, biases. And so I think also looking at specifically the systems in which we live in and how can we be critical of those and what can we actually do to transform those and create a new system that is actually much more equitable.
The continued denial in institutions. But frankly, also in these days of technology and social media and the narratives, especially right now, the old and new media, I feel that there's continued misinformation. There's also been the narrative side of things, right? The old media has been the story of one monolithic race, which is majority, like one group in the US historically. There's never been stories told about how other minorities. In fact, one good example of that is if you look at the transcontinental railway, right? If you see that, like the finishing construction over in Utah, when the two railways connect together, there's only one picture, and that picture is only one race. All the minorities have all taken out, including more than many Chinese who are involved with it. There's no picture whatsoever of any Chinese in that picture at all, or Asian or other minorities, Black and minorities of color, for instance. So that has been an issue, and so in addition to what Lupe as well as what Shanti have mentioned, so there's been a lot of this untruth stories that's actually misled people. So we need to change that as well. Thank you.
One point I would like to make is in regards to the passage of Asian reparations. I think we need to make sure that, at least as far as I understand it, that we don't let things like this divide communities of color. I think it's important that they gave the Asians reparations or the Japanese reparations for World War II. But that doesn't mean that we can't come together, that the Asians can't support Blacks in their quest for reparations for slavery. So I think it's important that we don't go for the okey doke, that we don't go for like these surface appearances, and develop a long-term strategy in order to make sure that every community gets its needs met. And I do believe that is possible. I do believe it's possible that for every community to get its needs met.
I think just following up on the last round of contributions, I'd like to stick to this question of the persistence of inequality and injustice and prejudice and antagonism a little bit, and just invite you to reflect on whether there might be some contribution to the persistence of these processes into the current day that is made by broader economic or cultural conditions. Like we have a hyper inegalitarian society these days in the United States. As we're seeing in the pandemic, we're also a hyper individualistic culture, right? And do you have any thoughts about whether these broader conditions might feed into the persistence of prejudice and exclusion and antagonism in some ways? I'd be curious to hear what you think about this before we then move to talking about remedies looking forward. So
I think I mentioned earlier in one of our discussions that economics can't explain or account for races. The reason I make that claim, if you look up Tulsa, Oklahoma, T-Town, the Black Wall Street, they had their own bus line, their own hospital. They flourished. White folks came in and destroyed it. They rebuilt it, and they came back and destroyed it again. So here you have a community of Black folk that are thriving independently and not dependent upon white society. And what do? You destroy it. Frederick Douglass, My Bondage, My Freedom. He also talks about economics can't account for this notion of racism or discrimination or slavery. what stuck me was he talked about how the dogs and the horses, they made sure that they had warm blankets in the winter, but the children were walking around barefooted without pants. I mean, that's deep. That the animals were more valued than slaves, but slaves were human beings. In fact, if you look at that piece with Jim Lynch, he does say that we're men. he admits. He does admit that we're men. But men need to be broken like horses. So all that to say is that when blacks do try to strive economically, it's destroyed. And so I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
That's really important. Shanti, do you have any thoughts about this?
I guess I'd just like to second the idea that education is so important, that our education system has failed us in this way for so long, and you see it persisting today with the real harsh resistance to even learning now or teaching in schools about race and racism. So that's really pretty strong force still happening today. And then reiterate what Raymond was just saying about economic forces, of course, is important. Of course, that doesn't tell the whole story. But it's the interplay of all these things. It's the culture of individualism that people can say, I'm not racism. I'm not racist. I didn't have anything to do with that. I'm just doing my own thing. I have no responsibility for others. So, cultural forces, education, economics, our history, you can't untangle any of those. You can't untangle any of that. So unfortunately, we could have classes and years of coursework on, on the issue, but it's no answer but to say it's very complicated.
A lot of things are feeding into it. Yeah. Lupe, anything you'd like to add on this?
No, it really makes me think about the social movements around ethnic studies, even trying to get ethnic studies in our high schools, in our grammars. I mean, that fight, it's still going on. Yeah. And so that is a particular, again, what I would say policies and practices that we're still trying to allow the multiple narratives of our communities, right? The multiple diversities. And I would say, we here at UC Berkeley even had that, Ronald Takaki, that was his whole thing with the American cultures, to ground this, right, into the reality of multiple voices and communities. And we had a fight on our hands here within the UC system. And I mean, at least Berkeley, and trying to get the American culture. So to me, it's really taking these complexities and inequalities and grounding them in something like specifically ethnic studies. And even now our departments are, instead of flourishing, they're getting smaller. And in the Chicano Latino Studies program, we're down to 3 faculty when at one point we were flourishing with so many. So these are the concrete things that we need to continue to lift. And Ron Takaki was my mentor, and I just think about, A Different Mirror, the book, which really talks about the contributions of all of us to this country, and to think about that. So, that has, but right now it really came to mind as we were speaking about these inequalities, and we can't even get our act together to talk about, let everybody speak, let everybody's history and her story be spoken.
Yep, thank you. Chuck.
Yeah, I certainly think that, especially with COVID, there's really been a haves and have-nots. And I mentioned to you that the Asian American community is extremely diverse. We have, Philadelphia's per capita GDP, and some of our, but we've also have the lowest, per capita GDP within also our group as well. And so, and it's really what I would say the fundamental aspect of living, just living in a respectful way. So obviously that's very important. But really acknowledging what Shanti, what Lupe, what Raymond have said too, it's in order to really kind of get to that point. And I think it's really about, like education. It's really the social fabrics of things that we need to provide, at the lowest denominator level, so that we can actually help these people and then help raise up everybody. But certainly, it's so that's why I think it's timing wise, it's very, very important that we have such a conversation, because COVID is really worsening the situation. And so I'm very happy that we're actually all, coming together and sharing these insights. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chuck. I think transitioning now to the last phase of our discussion, I'd like to invite you to reflect a little bit about, concrete things we can do moving forward to at least incrementally move towards a more inclusive, just, equitable society and culture. What are some concrete steps that we could take going forward? Why don't we start maybe by just thinking about the short term, and maybe the Cal community on campus or the community of alumni. What are some things that we could do to create solidarity amongst the members of groups who've been oppressed or been victims of prejudice of different kinds in different ways? And how can we concretely, what are some of the short-term things we can do within our local communities to move closer to a kind of just and inclusive society? Lupe, why don't you start us off on this?
Sure. I think the first thing, they're very basic things, but I think they're very, very important things. We need to spend time with each other across communities and be in relationship with each other. That means breaking bread with each other. It also means dialoguing, and that we can agree to disagree respectfully, but that we need to be in relationship with each other. I think it's really, really important. The other thing is, in a short term, is how do we support each other's struggles? Are we, an ally, co-conspirator? So how do we actually show up for each other, I think is going to be very important. And part of that is, again, part of dialogue. Again, we have many, many things that we can already work with. We have the undocumented movement that also still, there's a lot of issues that we've been addressing undocumented students who are DACA, but what happens to all the unDACA, those who don't even get help? So, there's a lot of work and support with each other, particularly in that community. Again, it was mentioned, the anti-hate, the unhoused. We're talking about what's going on with the Black Lives Matter right now, with what's going on with Afghanistan. How do we show up for each other, I think is really, really important. And to dialogue, if we don't know, to inform ourselves and to be conscious about those struggles and what are those things that unite us. So I would definitely start with the basics first, if we have not done so. And then those of us who have done some of that work for a while, the next step, I think, is the long run, is really movement, building and organizing. So
yeah, but we'll get to that in just a minute. So, Shanti, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would pretty much echo that. I feel like we should support each other's movements. For example, reparations for slavery, that should be on everyone's agenda. Rematriation of land should be on everyone's priority list. And there's so many of those, right? Protests against Asian hate. We should all be out there and supporting those in the best way we can as leaders in the Berkeley community. I'm sure a lot of people in Berkeley don't even know what that means, rematriation of land. And so to spread that awareness in your own communities is so helpful. So there's other ideas, but I think we can start there.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Chuck?
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge what everybody said, and I just even through this dialogue today, I've learned so much. Shanti, I actually didn't know that at one point Native and Indigenous people were as much as 10 to 20 million people, and now it's down to at one point like what like 250,000 people. That is horrifying. And I think Lupe about all these discriminations, and Jimmy as well as Raymond. I want to say that that's exactly right. That is, we really need to, even within ourselves, we really didn't know much about our struggles and the histories and all that. So this is really kind of a way for us to get together and to understand that, but also to move things forward. One of the things that we are leading, and this is something that through technology and like this, we don't need to be in person right now. And in fact, we are organizing a number of these things which are online, virtually. So we're actually, for instance, we're inviting, Jennifer Doudna, which just won the Nobel Prize. She will be a keynote speaker along with Dean of Engineering, Sujay King Liu. They're going to be doing a session about sharing the latest discovery and sciences and whatnot. On November 4th. So things like that, which I want to invite all of you and your members to participate. We've also have other mentors, and these are executives from Google, from LinkedIn, also from McKinsey, for instance. These are people that are role models, right? And they're going to be doing mentorship sessions. So we have that, that is open to the entire Berkeley community. And we want to really kind of provide more opportunities to help each other in the immediate and short term, because these are things that we can learn from them, the successes of others and role models of others, how we can actually help each other to become even more successful. So those are the things that I see that we can do an immediate impact, that we can actually take actions and move forward together and succeed together. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you all for those reflections. I'm going to conclude our discussion with one final question, and it's just kind of an invitation to think about the longer term. I think this has been a fascinating discussion, and it's really brought home all kinds of things, but among other things, how far we still are from the ideal of a genuinely, community of equals that recognizes each member as having, full entitlement to equal standing, and that is genuinely inclusive and respectful of all of the cultural and historical traditions that feed into it. So, looking in the long term, do you have any thoughts about, programs or structures or things that we might work to nurture and to build that might help us to come closer to this, to this kind of inclusive ideal of a really kind of egalitarian community?
I'm looking towards coming together for violence prevention in our communities. Violence prevention looks different. Violence prevention looks different in the Asian community. Violence prevention looks different in East Oakland. And what I would like to see is a coming together of representatives from communities of color and talk about how do we, violence takes different forms, but how do we come together to end violence in our local communities? I would like to see that happen. I think it manifests itself in different ways, but I think this collaboration right here, I think we'll get a variety of ideas on how to deal with it. So I hope this isn't the end of the communication between us. I hope we continue the communication in the future, because that's what's going to determine whether the violence decreases instead of increases. What we do here today and what we continue to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raymond. Shanti, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think going back to what I said before about how the problem is so complicated, if we're looking to the future to fix such a multiple systems of injustice coming together, such a complicated problem, how do we do that? And I think that what's already been said in response to this question is exactly how we do that. So my idea is we each use our spheres of influence, our talents and our connections and our experiences to do our part in the change, the radical change that needs to occur. So like Lupe and Jimmy were talking about education, let's increase the let's have a robust ethnic studies program at Cal. That's not my sphere, but that's maybe Lupe's role. And then Chuck is using his leadership position with alumni to just raise awareness and to really, collaborate amongst the groups. Raymond is using his expertise working in his community for violence prevention. I'm a lawyer. I'm working to fix a completely broken criminal justice system. And so using our strengths to just create sustained, persistent work in all of these areas. It takes us all to just have just nonstop hard work.
Yeah.
Is how I think we're going to have long-term change, and enrolling, of course, others to come along with us.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much.
Great.
Lupe.
Yes, thank you. I just love what has already been said. I think about our young people and our children coming and growing up in what kind of world. And the first thing that comes to me is to have them still have the ability to imagine and create something different. If we don't change the institutions that we currently have. So one of those is that, and really I'm thinking about the challenges before us with climate change, huge honor, and that we all have a role to play with that, every single one of us, and how we can help that. But the other one for me, and I love when you said about our spheres of work, is not only to use those, but also to continue to keep checking our privileges within that from those of us that are there, but more about organizing our power that we can collectively galvanize. And of course, I work with young people, and I've always said the two biggest things that move things around a university are students and alumni, and it helps if you had money. So my point is that it's around power and privilege and also leverage. So using those leverages is really, really important. And so for me around the alumni, it's really, I know within the Chicanx Latinx community, we're organizing all 10 UC Chicano Latino alumni. What can we galvanize together to, again, at a particular level? We need it coming from the bottom up and the top down, but we need to have that leverage together. And so my dream would be to see a BIPOC alumni organization at some point, that we have Black, Indigenous, and people of color, all who are educated, having some kind of particular organizing vision. And I will just finally end that. I hope that we continue to practice, like in our community, called in Lakesh, which means you are my other me. So we constantly check in that we're all one people. And so that saying constantly reminds me that you my other me. So whatever I do, whatever I act on is always integrated with each other.
Thank you. Chuck.
I love what you said, Lupe. You are the other me. And I love what you said, Shante, about really using our collective strengths, and Jimmy on education, and Raymond in terms of violence prevention, which I think you guys will all agree that I think we need to institutionalize everything. And what it means is we need to put it systematic, not just one person, one off. It's really going to need to be consistent efforts, all of us as leaders, collectively working together. Now, I've actually been traveling with Andrew Yang, and one of the things that we want to do, certainly within the Asian American community, is having a voice at the table. And this is the same thing. We can actually, starting immediately with Berkeley, to be honest with you. I mean, and I'm talking about Berkeley. I mean, frankly, right now we look at Berkeley, all of us combined, minorities of color, we're, I think, more than 60-70% representation at UC Berkeley. And yet, when I look at our institution, even Berkeley, I mean, as close as Berkeley, I mean, we look at we're talking about the top management of Berkeley. We're talking about vice chancellor and above. How many of our representations are there at Berkeley? I would say very little. So I think that we can make things as immediate as Berkeley in terms of asking for changes and things like that, and positive changes that have our representation at the table. So starting with that, I say that institutionalize everything, and that collectively, just like what you guys all said, I just love what you all said, which is really kind of, let's use our collective strength and make things a more equitable or inclusive community for us all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for those incredibly illuminating and stimulating reflections. This has been just a really eye-opening and illuminating discussion for me. I've so enjoyed getting to know each of you and to hear your reflections on these issues. I think I've learned a lot personally, and I think our audience will as well. And I think these kinds of discussions are things that we need to keep going forward to make progress on the issues we've been discussing. I want to thank the Cal Alumni Association in particular for taking the initiative to organize this ongoing series of discussions. And it was an honor and a pleasure for me to be invited to take part as moderator today. And I hope the discussions can continue into the future. So thank you very much, everyone, for the important reflections today. And thanks to Chuck and Raymond and the Cal Alumni Association for organizing this dialogue.